Okay, good morning, Dad.
Morning.
Today is Monday, December 30th. And we can start this off talking about this energy war that's going on. Um, my understanding is that there's a contract ending from gas that transits through Ukraine from Russia to Europe. And I know that Fico is very upset and he's going to cut energy off to Ukraine. So, can you just tell me what's going on here and the significance of this?
Sure. Yeah, this is. It, it has to be made clear that this contract's ending because Ukraine wanted it in. It declared that it was not going to renew the contract. Yeah, there's a pipeline that runs through what the name of it is Zulcha. It's the town. It's the only town that was captured by the Ukrainians in Kursk. It's right across the border from in Russia in the Kursk region, right across the border from Ukraine. And I remember there was some speculation as to maybe they wanted to get that well, or they would blow it up or something. But no, they've been gas has been running through this pipeline. It enters through the Kursk region, passes through. It's called the Druzhba pipeline, which means friendship, and it was built during the Soviet era. And all through, the conflict, um, the gas has been flowing through it. It hasn't been damaged in any way by the war. The both sides have held to the contract that pre-existed um, uh, the SMO, and it was really to everybody's benefit. Of course, Gazprom is the Russian monopoly company that operates the pipeline, has been sending gas through it, and so of course they've received some income from this consistently according to the original contract, and then Europe, certain European countries in particular. We're talking about Hungary, Moldova, and Slovakia have been receiving gas from this pipeline. Now, so but more than that, in fact, Ukraine itself has been drawing um, gas from this pipeline. They do it through a kind of fiction where, rather than they don't pay the Russians for it, but they make an arrangement with these other countries. You say, okay, we pretend that, we send it to you and you send us back some. But of course, that's really not possible. So what they do is that's the fiction that they work with, but they do just draw, siphon off some of this gas. And that's not a problem with the Russians either. So it's been to everybody's benefit. But just recently, in a kind of I think just in a fit of nihilistic rage, they, because I'm sorry, I don't see how this helps Ukraine or Europe, Ukraine supporters in any way. You can say, well, it hurts uh, Slovakia and Hungary, and Ukraine has differences with them, obviously, because they have been pushing for negotiations and negotiated settlement to the conflict, and that's against the current policy of Ukraine. So there have been many angry words directed at both Fico, the president of Slovakia, and um, against Viktor Orban of Hungary. Um, but the fact is that by supplying gas to these countries, the overall gas situation is improved in all of Europe. Because of course now if they're deprived of gas, they need to draw gas from other sources. That means the liquefied natural gas um, uh, or gas that comes through the Turk Stream pipeline that passes through Istanbul. And this is already quite limited and is really not sufficient for Europe's needs. The price is very high already and is continuing to rise. So this will only aggravate the situation, for all of Europe, not just for these countries, and it's going to aggravate the situation for Ukraine too. So the question is why. Now it seems like Ukraine didn't even really think through this whole thing, which I don't know. It just seems to me extraordinary. That they didn't really realize, oh, this means we don't get gas. This means that everybody's going to, we're actually aggravating the overall situation. Well, I suppose so, with reference to Europe, they have a lot of supporters for this kind of policy. Earlier in the conflict, very early in the conflict, Poland just shut down a pipeline. It was gas that actually went to Germany. And then, of course, the most extraordinary thing of all was the destruction of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline by the United States. I think there's just no question it was the United States that did that. And Europe accepted it. In fact, clearly there are many supporters of these moves within Europe, within the European establishment. I think you have to emphasize it's the establishment. We're not talking about the people who want less gas. It's just the globalist elites see this as somehow, it just makes no sense to me as a reasonable policy. But I don't think the Ukrainians, really thought through the fact that, okay, now we don't get any gas. It hurts them directly. So after making this declaration, they then proposed, and then Russia said, okay, fine, you don't want gas, you don't get gas. It's your choice. Then they said, well, we have this other idea. We'll create some kind of consortium of these other gas buyers, and they'll buy the gas, and then they can send the gas to us, which really means is that, okay, you pay them, there's a middleman who takes a cut, and then we still get the gas. Now, the Russians refused, I think just yesterday or the day before, Putin said that, no, this is not going to work. And the reason is that Ukraine has a lawsuit, actually, that is brought against the Russians for cutting off gas on another pipeline. Now, this is ridiculous because the Russians did not cut off the gas. Again, it was the Ukrainians. They decided we don't, because the Russians, I think, took over a pump station in the course of the war several months ago. They said, okay, forget it. You got the pump station. We're cutting off the gas. So, we're not going to take this gas anymore, which doesn't make any logical sense, right? Just like the Suja, yeah, I think it's the town right there by the border in Kursk. There's a pump station there. The Russians had it up the whole time until until the Kursk incursion, and eventually the Russians will take it back. But it didn't make any difference. They just decided at that point to cut off gas in that pipeline. And then they brought a lawsuit against the Russians for cutting off the gas. The whole thing was completely absurd, right? But the problem is the Ukrainians know that the court that they're bringing this lawsuit to it's in Stockholm, and it just has a history of making ridiculous decisions against Russia. And so I think the Ukrainians were confident that they could win this lawsuit, and then they would be able to fine the Russians and just, not receive the gas, but at the same time penalize the Russians and receive regular payments from Russia. Now, if it's Gazprom doing this, Gazprom's not going to make those payments, right? They're not going to pay any fine on such a ridiculous decision. But if you have a consortium, they may be forced because they're within the West, whatever group of companies, and they would actually be forced by law to do it. And so the Russians said, we're not going down this road. I'm sorry, So it looks like on January 1st, there will be no more gas, and Ukraine will suffer. Ukraine is already in a huge energy crisis because the attacks on the electricity grid. And Europe is facing, an energy crisis. It looks like this is going to be a cold winter. They were lucky to have a couple of warm winters. The previous two were rather warm. So this time their reserves are lower. The price is rising, fairly rapidly is my understanding, and it will rise more, especially when this pipeline is cut off. That's the situation in detail. And I think it's just kind of, it's just emblematic of the whole economic war against Russia. It's a war that, it's kind of a war where you've taken the great majority of the cannons and turned around and you're firing at yourself. Viktor Orban put it this way: it's not that we shot ourselves in the foot; it's that we shot ourselves in a lung. I mean, it does tremendous damage to Europe, the whole thing. And it just, this, I don't know how to explain it. I think, historians will probably puzzle over this for decades and maybe centuries. What were these people doing?
You said that there's a lot of the elite within Europe that actually support this decision. Do they offer any reason why it's a good thing? Why they support this?
I can, from their language, it's just, you get the sense it's, first of all, almost a sense of religious purity. We don't want Russian gas. We don't want, this evil Russian gas, this evil Russian oil. Now, it's all absurd because actually, for example, the oil, it's continued to come from Russia, but via India. But at least you can pretend it's not Russian oil. And that just doesn't make any sense, but it's just the kind of language that used. We have to. It almost seems some sort of obsession with moral purity. It's when they try to put out a logical argument, it says that we don't want to be dependent on Russia. They can use this as a weapon against us. The thing is, they've never had a history of doing that. Even all through the Soviet years, the Soviet government was very, very good about honoring contracts. It's just something they understand. It's because it's obviously in their interest, in the Russian interest, just as it was in the Soviet interest in the past. It's in the interest of both parties. And I think that's the thing, is the larger principle when you come to economics is that any transaction, or contract that is reached between voluntarily, between two parties is to the benefit of both. Otherwise, why do you enter into the contract? Why do you make the transaction? Just like when you go to a store and you buy a gallon of milk, it's a decision that you've made that gallon of milk is worth, more than I don't know what the price is now, to be honest. I haven't bought a gallon of milk, maybe $4 or something.
Yeah, $3.50 at Walmart.
Okay, it's $3.50, right? It's worth more to you than that $3.50, so you give up $3.50. And then Walmart, makes the opposite. It's to the benefit of both parties. That's just how economic transactions work. That's the basic underlying principle. So, when all these, I just remember, like at the beginning of the sanctions war, I say, well, this is obvious, I thought it was going to hurt Russia significantly, but that it would recover from it. But it also clearly had to hurt Europe, because Europe was benefiting from these. Otherwise, why did they have this trade? Why did they purchase this gas? But they just made this decision, which just seems to me again, it was an economically illiterate decision. And it turned out to actually be much worse, because sometimes, like in the case of the gas, Russia has lost one major customer, but it's based in this, this huge landmass, Eurasia, and they're very populous countries off to the east and the south, India and China, above all. And so they have alternatives. Yes, they end up having to sell it, at a slightly discounted rate, but they still make good money. If they had Europe, they would do even better, because, the more demand you have, the stronger your own negotiating position is when it comes to drawing up a contract, right? But they still do quite well. There still is huge demand on the other side of the continent. And so they say, okay, yeah, well, we lost a little bit on this, but, we're going to do fine. And maybe in the long run, they'll lose nothing, But the Europeans just, they're at that end of the continent. They don't have their own energy sources. And they were really utterly dependent on the Russians. And they're just, the replacements that they've come by are just much more expensive. They're buying LNG, which is, like last I heard, was 4 times the price of Russian gas, LNG from the US, and also LNG from Russia. But their efforts, again, maybe it's part of this purity obsession or something, or just this misunderstanding of failure to grasp the basic principles of economics on the part of the elite there. There are moves within Europe to shut off, the LNG supplies from Russia too.
It is unbelievable, because, like you said, this is a very basic concept of economics. I think every single political leader in Europe should understand this. So, kind of what you're saying to me is it's just this hatred of Russia overrides everything.
Yeah, I think it overrides. I think that's, how can you? It's not. Sometimes there's some sort of attempt at supplying, a reason. We need to become energy independent. No, they've actually become much more dependent on more expensive sources of energy, right? I think it's just that the hatred of Russia just overrides reason, and it's just driving them on the self-destructive course, because it's hurting them greatly. This last decision. It's just amazing to me. You would think that there would be, we have Viktor Orban and we have Fico, but that there would be at least some others who are waking up and saying, okay, I can't stand the Russians, but we can't do this to ourselves, people. Hey, let's stop the Ukrainians. And the Americans clearly are not. I mean, the Americans are the ones who actually blew up, Nord Stream. The Germans clearly aren't. They knew that the Americans blew up their own pipeline, but but they kept quiet. They submitted to it. So
Right.
I'm just sort of dumbfounded. I know this has been going on, but I think you have to sometimes step back and say how extraordinary the situation really is. Like how extraordinary an event the Nord Stream destruction was. I mean, that was, again, an attack by the supposed ally on a major piece of energy infrastructure in Europe that did tremendous damage, is continuing to do tremendous damage to Europe's leading economy, again, by an ally. And there's silence. What has happened to these people? I mean, sometimes, we get used to it, but it is extraordinary.
Right. Do you think you said kind of Zelensky kind of did this in sort of didn't think this through, it might have been kind of nihilistic rage? Do you think part of his thinking is that if we're going down, then we're taking Europe down with us in a way, kind of like if we're suffering so much, we want Europe to suffer, although Ukraine's going to suffer the most out of all this, from what you say, right? I mean, there just wasn't thinking.
Yeah,
it was just...
Yeah. Well, it's just part of it. This actually started before the SMO. You can find it actually going all the way back to the coup in 2014 and following, the annexation of Crimea. That over the course of, those years, let's say from 2014 to 2022, the Ukrainians just kind of progressively severed their ties with Russia. And I remember at the time thinking, again, this, because I'm not an economist, but I have a basic understanding of economics. I said, this doesn't make sense for Ukraine. It obviously doesn't. I mean, they have, all kinds of reasons to be trading with the Russians, more than any other country in the world, and they're cutting themselves off. Now, I just want to point out to a happy contrast is Georgia. The Georgians aren't particularly fond of the Russians. They have some beefs. I think they understand actually why the Russians invaded back in 2008, because actually the Georgians attacked them first, killed Russian peacekeepers, right, in South Ossetia. And in fact, they made an apology to the Russians for that. But they still have a beef, I think, about what happened in Abkhazia and South Ossetia prior to that, and how I think they feel like the Russians intervened in those conflicts in a way that was detrimental to Georgia. So that they have their differences with Russia, but they have people in charge there that actually are interested in the good of the Georgian people. And they understand that their trade with Russia is extremely important to them, to the prosperity of their own people. And so in spite of Western pressure, they've maintained that trade. Now, the Ukrainians just from the start have had this, this completely, it was a delusional regime. And they, again, I guess they have some pie in the sky kind of fantasy that we're going to become a Western nation one day. And becoming a Western nation somehow means cutting all ties with Russia. And then, if we do that, and, we'll be embraced by the West and we'll be part of this new happy Western European future. And then there's just anti-Russian rage too. I mean, I think there's a mix of the both. There's this unrealistic thinking and this irrational hatred, and the two of them, combined to, and have led to a series of irrational, self-destructive policy decisions.
So how dire is the energy situation in Europe now? You said that energy prices are already 4 times what they were prior to the SMO. So, and we've seen Germany begin to deindustrialize, but now with this additional cutoff of energy to Europe, are we looking at? And you said we're looking at a colder winter than the past 2 years. And we'll see how that plays out, but. What could Europeans expect to pay for gas in the coming months? Do you have any
Yeah,
idea or any
I don't
predictions?
have any idea. Those kind of things are very hard to predict. It's just going to be higher. It's already too high, and there's already suffering the consequences. Again, already many industrial giants in Germany in particular have laid off workers, have cut back, have closed down, and that has it's a consequence of those higher energy prices. And if they continue to rise, and it just seems to me that it's inevitable that they will. I'm not going to make any guesses to the extent of the rise that this will continue. And there may be, if it gets really bad, there may be extended blackouts. In a way, there already are blackouts, but they've been limited to industry, and so people don't see it. They don't feel it immediately. The end result is a lot of these companies shut down, but in the near term, it's maybe not so visible.
It's amazing to me that we're not seeing more protest in Europe amongst these capitals for this. I
Yeah,
mean, with their cost of living going up, people losing their jobs, just the economy's tanking. I mean, the whole EU economy is going down thanks to these higher energy prices and
right.
all these
Yeah,
sanctions
there are
that
other
were slapped
factors
on
too,
Russia.
other bad policies, but the energy is very, very important, especially for you know uh, a country like Germany that depends very much on heavy industry, and heavy
Right.
industry is very energy
Right.
intensive.
I mean, energy is an input into everything. It's the
Right.
basic input for any type of production, any type of economy. Of course, energy is the underlying base for it. And so the idea that they're just cutting it off from themselves. And I wonder how long will the Europeans accept it? I mean, in February, we will be having the elections in Germany. And I wonder if the moves like this will cause further support for the AfD. Elon Musk has also been getting very involved into politics these days, and I'm just wondering how, and he's thrown his support behind the AfD. So I just wonder if this could help propel the AfD to the
I'm
forefront.
sure,
And
I'm sure. I clearly has helped them already, and will continue to help them. The question is whether because all the other parties are allied against them. They have to do more than just win. I think the current polls show that the woman that was selected by the AfD to run for the chancellorship in February, that she is ahead of Merz. She would be, coming first, but they still don't have a majority, which means that she wouldn't be able to form a government because no other party is willing at this point to work with them. They're going to have to break the 50% barrier, and then we'll see what happens. If they approach 50%, then the establishment might just try to shut them down, which is, it seems in the name
pull a
of
Romania.
democracy, of course. Yeah, right, exactly.
Right. Yeah, it's wild. And when I try to prepare questions for these, talking to you, interviewing about this, it's tough for me to focus on what is the biggest conflict and what we should be focusing on. The Ukraine or the Middle East. I mean, in my mind, when we talk about what's happening in Ukraine, it seems like it's done. Ukraine, there's nothing that Ukraine can do to turn this around. The only possibility is if it goes nuclear, if all of NATO comes in, but that just doesn't seem like a
Yeah,
possibility
I
to
don't
me. It
think so.
seems
Yeah.
right. It seems so. It's a tragedy what's happening, and it's just kind of a story of how much damage can be afflicted on Europe during this whole process, and of course Ukraine is just going to be utterly destroyed, and how much territory that Russia's going to take. But it doesn't seem to me like there's any way the story is kind of written now. I feel like to a large
Yeah,
extent. Would
well,
you agree?
I think it's written to the extent that Russia will win this war. And, it's a question of how. And I think, I agree with John Mearsheimer that it will be an ugly victory. He's confident that they will. And it was never even in doubt, really, for anybody who was looking at the bigger picture, even back in let's say the fall of 2022, when Ukraine had its success in the Kharkov region and the Kherson region. Anyone looking at just the balance of forces, of productive power, of population, of total armaments. There's just no question that the Russians, when they set their mind to, and they did immediately. It was in the fall of 22 that Putin mobilized 300,000 reservists, and then they began the process of a voluntary enlistment that is built up the forces. And so anyway, they were always going to win. They are winning, and it's a question of what kind of victory it will be. How far will they go? What. And then I think the other big question is also is like we've discussed earlier, is how the West will take it. What will the repercussions be in the West? I think in there are going to be repercussions, for all of the NATO countries, including the U.S. But the greatest impact will be on Europe, and it could lead to the rise of these alternative parties, of these populist parties that always oppose these policies. That maybe it's just like the people will vote for them overwhelmingly, and they'll be able to overcome the kind of the blockades that have been put on them by the establishment. That's a possibility, at least in some countries. But it could also, because at the same time you see this trend towards growing authoritarianism in places like Romania and Germany, just throughout Europe, and maybe we'll have that authoritarianism will only intensify, and it'll now they do everything in the name of democracy at some point, which is absurd. Canceling elections in the name of democracy, suppressing political parties in the name of democracy. At some point, they may even drop the pretense, and they just will, say we're
No more democracy.
Yeah, right. The democracy was a mistake. We wise people will now rule you. Shut up. We'll see. It's going to be interesting.
If these alternative parties do come to power, would we look at potentially countries leaving NATO or the EU? Would this spell the end of the American empire if European countries start to break away and say, we're done being vassals of the U.S. The U.S. has destroyed our energy infrastructure here. They pushed us to this, then pushed these sanctions on Russia that we have been bearing the brunt of. Really, Europeans have, not the Americans, and not even really the Russians so much, right? It's right. Europe that is suffering thanks to all the policies that are pretty much written in Washington, D.C., and then handed to the people in London and Brussels, and they just go along with it. So you think there has to build up enough resentment where they just we're done with the NATO. We're done with
I'd say
EU.
one thing. Yeah, clear. It is true that these countries are vassals of the U.S., but it seems to me that, they're very willing vassals. That a lot of these European countries are even more gung-ho on these policies than the Americans are. I should say, the governments. Again, with a few exceptions, like maybe in the Baltics, it's really not the people. But yeah, as for what you're saying about, NATO possibly breaking up, it could. I would say, again, it's sort of like there are, I see, like history is always more creative than our own imaginations. When you look into the future, you see some possibilities, and then there's always something that happens that you just never even saw. But, what I see the main, let's say, just to simplify things, the two roads, the one towards authoritarianism, the one towards the right, of the populist parties, which are mostly considered conservative, but some of them are leftist, right? Okay, that's one possibility. The other is the rising authoritarianism. So, NATO, what happens to NATO kind of depends on that. If it's the populist parties that win the battle, it may spell the end of NATO. It may mean that NATO starts to break up as some of these countries pull out and say we don't want to be a part of this. But then if we have the authoritarian model, actually NATO might even become a greater force. It just is something that's imposed to you may have some sort of fortress Europe where they circle the wagons and they actually start to devote a lot of money to defense spending. so far it's all been talk. There's been very, very little increase. So I kind of wonder if they really have the will to go down that. I mean, we'll go down that road, but we'll see.
Right. And kind of what I've learned during this conflict is that the numerical value you put towards your military doesn't really mean that much. When we say that these countries are going to devote more of their GDP to defense spending, really as part of NATO, it almost seems like we will give more money to the U.S. defense industries to purchase weapons. There's not really so much the ability. I mean, look, Germany can't even manufacture commercial vehicles anymore thanks to the energy cutoff. How do they expect to ramp up and all of a sudden start churning out planes and tanks? It's not going to happen. You can just throw money at it and just throw it down the drain. I don't see them really
that's
building
a good point.
up.
Yeah, actually, that's one thing that we've just learned about the U.S. military. The U.S. spends an extraordinary amount of money on its military. It's close to half of what all the money that's spent in the world on militaries. So if the value, the dollar value really was reflective of the of military capacity, of effectiveness, then the U.S. shouldn't have any peers. Again, the U.S. spends, I don't know exactly what the ratio is, but it's 5-1 or 10-1 compared to Russia.
Yeah, probably greater, to be honest.
Depending on how you measure it. But it's a very, very lopsided. There's no equity between the two. The U.S. spends much, much more than Russia does. So, by those rights, and of course they're just one of the countries in NATO. Again, if you were looking at the amount of money that's spent on the military, and a lot of people looked at this, myself included, when the SMO began in 2022, there should have been no contest. NATO should have won hands down. But I think we're learning is that the value that the monetary value does not reflect the reality, and I think too, we see countries promising to increase their defense spending, countries in Europe to increase their defense spending to, let's say, 3%. It doesn't mean anything, if in the end, because you could raise the prices by that much and then you've done it, right? And that's probably what's going to happen is that, because of inflation and the growing demand for this limited resource, prices will rise. And so it'll be easy for them to reach that 3% threshold, but there will be no change in the underlying reality.
Right. I think that's just proof of corruption, right? And essentially money laundering through, if you're being able to spend this amount of money and you're not really getting anything out, that just means you're just lining pockets of, the military industrial complex, people that are associated to it.
Yeah, that's right. It's again, it's not necessarily that any laws were broken. It's kind of open and above board corruption. It's institutional corruption. It's an institutional arrangement that doesn't provide, the goods that are actually needed, but enriches the people that are involved. Yeah.
Right. Do you think that's becoming exposed to most of the elite, that they're aware that this is the situation, that, hey, we spend all this money, but they know that it's not producing anything? I mean, if they go to Africa or South Korea, I say, give us some artillery shells, anybody got Patriot missiles, whatever you can give us. Then surely people realize that, hey, this is, right. And this is kind of what...
I don't think it's penetrated into the establishments. I think that they're still, it's we've talked about this a lot. It's just part of this general supremacist mindset. It's just something that they can't abandon. And so it's hard for them to say, hey, yeah, we're in trouble. We need to really retool, reconfigure, reindustrialize. They haven't raised the alarm bells. You find at the edges, some analysts make comments and occasionally it leaks into one of the major newspapers. But in general, that's not what's happening. It's just, it seems like they still, inhabit that old mindset, and they're just not going to let go of it.
When Ukraine loses this war, what do you think will be the biggest consequence for the outcome of this for the United States? Will it just be proof that the U.S. is a paper tiger, NATO is a paper tiger, or is it going to be, kind of what we said, the potential either the authoritarian new
Yeah.
authoritarian order of Europe, or the throwing off the shackles of the U.S.
Yeah.
empire and
Right.
the
Yeah.
end of the United States? I mean, what do you think is?
Yeah. I think I'll just say again that well, the impact will be much greater on Europe. Already it is. It's easier for the U.S. to walk away from wars because, again, we're out there. We have a continent pretty much unto ourselves, oceans on each side, and we can just, we won't be able to shake it off completely like so many of our other wars. It won't be possible to memory hold it in the same way. So it will damage the reputation of the U.S. internationally, and I think domestically too. Probably not as much as it should. We have a remarkable spin machine. It'll all be the fault of the Ukrainians, the fault of the Europeans, and already we're seeing this. There are stories being appearing in papers about how we're disappointed in the way that the Ukrainians are using this weapon system or that weapon system. We suggested this and they didn't do that. They're not mobilizing 18-year-olds soon enough. It's all their fault. And I think we'll get a lot of that. And it'll work to some extent, but I don't think it'll be entirely successful. This will be two major defeats. So it will damage the reputation of the U.S. And now how that plays out in the U.S. is hard to say. Again, it's just you're dealing with an irrational elite. Does it mean that they actually become more aggressive? Does it mean that they actually kind of sober up and start focusing on their, addressing the weaknesses that were exposed? Remains to be seen. And again, I'll just say for Europe, there's the authoritarian tendency, and then there's the populist. And we could see both things happening. It could be part of Europe retreats into fortress Europe, and then other countries break away. Interestingly, like one of those countries that might break away is Italy. There was a poll came out just a few days ago that showed has support for the present policy in Ukraine. It's just like as long as it takes kind of policy, right? And that support for that was highest among the poll countries. It was highest in Sweden, followed by Denmark, and then the UK. And all in those three countries, there was majority support for that policy. But then in these other countries, the majority actually supported reducing aid to Ukraine and pushing them to negotiate and to give up territories. And you found that in Germany, in France, in Spain, but above all in Italy. Like in Italy, it was very striking. The results were something like 4-1 in favor of ending the conflict and ceasing support to Ukraine. 4-1. It was very, very striking.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like there is this vassal mindset within Europe, but it's much more concentrated within smaller countries with populations 10 million less, because we talk about the Baltic states and we talk about the Scandinavian countries. These are countries with low populations, and they're the most, I think, terrified of the idea of not being under the US's wing. And I've noticed this mentality even talking with my European friends. I have a good friend in Norway, and I remember him saying like, well, would much rather be ruled by America than China. It's like, this is why. And I was just like, this is a dumb mindset. Like, you're Norwegian. Why there isn't, don't be ruled by either, but there is, I think, that mentality. And I think it's been very ingrained since World War II. They've just kind of felt like we are under the U.S. umbrella, and they will keep us safe, and we need to do whatever we want. We can't disappoint our U.S. masters. And I think that when you're a small country of a population of 5 million, something like this, that feeling might be exacerbated a little bit, because whereas these larger countries like Italy, Spain, and France, they have some sense of autonomy. They have a history. There's a little bit there, but
yeah,
do you think there's some truth to that?
I think there is, but I'll also point out that two of those Northern European countries were neutral, Sweden and Finland, all through the Cold War, and it served them very, very well. Sweden, it goes back even farther. It served them very well. They were very prosperous countries, and they recently abandoned this. And now, we have Sweden, and I'm sure it's true of Finland. I don't think it was included in this survey, but I think you would find very similar results in Finland. For some reason, it's just they've become very Russophobic. I mean, it's really quite extraordinary.
Yeah, it really is. Maybe we can talk just a little bit about this Russia's shadow fleet because I've been seeing headlines into it. First, I just want to know. I'll read you the headlines first. So the New
Okay.
York Times had a headline that said, "Has Russia's shadow fleet built to evade sanctions added sabotage to its lists?"
Uh-huh.
Business Insider: Germany calls for new sanctions on Russia's dark fleet that is damaging major undersea cables nearly every month. Political
Right.
says Finland probes Russian shadow fleet involvement in new Baltic cable break. So the way that these titles, if you read the headlines, it just sounds like there's this clandestine Russian fleet that's going out there breaking cables and committing sabotage across the high seas, essentially
Yeah.
pirates. Is that
Right.
what's going on?
Clearly, yeah, yeah. Actually, the whole shadow fleet, I think was a stroke of genius on the part of the propagandists in the West. It's called the shadow fleets. It quite literally sounds shady, right? Something that's rather nefarious, underhanded. And my understanding is simply that they don't get their insurance through Lloyd's of London, basically, which insures most ships in the world. And um, they don't because Lloyd's of London is complies with these sanctions on the ships. There's the price cap and then other various sanctions efforts to limit the export of Russian oil. So the Russians went to other insurers,
So
and
there's nothing illegal.
absolutely nothing illegal. Absolutely nothing illegal. So the whole shadow thing is just it implies it doesn't go out and they don't actually go out and say this is illegal, but by using these terms, they suggest that in people's minds, this is something really kind of obviously kind of again semi-criminal but it's nothing of the sort. It's just a very open and legal way of evading sanctions by going to other insurers, insurers in India or other parts of the world. Um, and then I think, like we talked about the recent incident in the Baltic or the cable between, I believe it was
Estonia and
Finland and
Finland.
in Estonia, right, was cut. It was a communication, I know, electric power cable.
Mm-hmm.
And they say that, they've accused the Russians. They said there was a Russian tanker there and they actually seized the tanker. And now these stories are coming out. So at the time I speculated that it could be, just speculated that it could be a false flag. Now I find myself leaning even more towards it because of the way it's being used in the news. I don't know, who knows what happened, but it just seems to me highly unlikely for the Russians to do this. It's not to their benefit at all, but it is to the benefit of people who of the establishment with the Western, hegemonists who are trying to shut down the export trade, and they're going right now. They are going after the so-called shadow fleet in a big way. I think just recently, the Biden administration came up with new sanctions against the Russian fleet. Now they're going after ship owners. A lot of these ships are not owned by the Russians. They're just um, other countries or companies in different countries around the world are um, have provided these for transport of Russian oil. Now they're going after those ship owners, um, and this story about what happened in the Baltic Sea, helps to apply the pressure and to scare people away from these ships, maybe insurers or whoever might be involved. And then it's actually it could hurt the Russians in the short run, but it's these the history of these sanctions is that they always find a way around them. And it may be that the Russians themselves will just have to buy all these ships. And, there will be people that are very willing to sell them to them. And then in this, the sanctions, they're sanction proof. Um, Obviously the courts in Russia are not going to impose fines on Russian ship owners. Um, So, but it is a part of this economic war, part of this energy war. And again, one that's actually, again, just like everything else we pointed to in this economic war, is self-destructive. Because by making it more difficult for the Russians to export oil, you're reducing the amount of oil on the world markets, and therefore you're going to raise the prices of oil around the world, including in the U.S. in this case. So everybody's going to suffer because of this. And I think that's actually a reason that the Biden administration didn't do this until after the election. Because they understood this
high gas prices for Trump.
Right. So if they did it like back in the spring or in the summer, it could have led to, it would have led to an increase in gas prices, and it would have damaged Harris's election effort.
Man, is it so much hard to ask for just to have a leader that wants to do something good for your country, that has the best interest of your country at heart? Let's lower the cost of living for people, that peace and prosperity. It's not a big ask, right? Yeah. I just don't understand how it seems like all of our politicians, it's about let's make life more miserable for our people because it might hurt this other politician, or I don't even care about these people. I just hate Russia so much that I just want to do this.
I think it's the latter. It's not that they're actually trying to immiserate their own population.
Well, I mean, just they don't clearly, care. Well, Biden obviously, to some extent here, he knows that he said he didn't do this before because he didn't want to have higher energy prices in the U.S. during this time. But now that he's out, he's like, well, screw the American people. Let's raise gas prices.
Obviously, he doesn't care, right? It's just like, again, his hatred for Russia overrides everything. That's what it. And also he says, maybe it'll hurt Trump. People will be angry because energy prices go up, and they'll blame that on him. Now, if Trump were smart, I think it's like as soon as he came into power, he would simply, lift those sanctions. Mm-hmm. But he may be, I know, you just never know with Trump. Again, you have a lot of people with it, among those that he appointed, that are completely on board with these kind of policies. And they just may convince him not to. But he should, just like, hopefully he will lift or reimpose, rather, the restrictions on the ATACMS missiles.
Mm. Yeah, I just wonder, how did Western politics, how did they all become captured by the globalists? How come nobody's really thinking about the best interests of their countries? It's all this ridiculous game.
And there's just this hive mind that you find. There used to be a greater diversity of thought. Like France was always kind of independent within Europe. It wasn't part of NATO for the longest time. And then, I think part of the problem is actually the creation of the EU. Originally, it was supposed to be just a mechanism for economic cooperation, but it's become much more than that. And over time, a central government has developed in Brussels that has been taking power over, and there's been a general transfer of power from the countries, the individual countries, the member states, to this central, unelected bureaucracy in Brussels. And the U.S. has always been in favor of that because they just much rather, it used to be, it was messy. You had to deal with each, convince each separate European state, to come on board. And sometimes the country would, like France, remember during the Iraq War. Right? And so that's why you had freedom fries and all that.
They tasted better.
Right. But anyway, so the U.S. was always in favor of the centralization, and now they've really got, their wish came true. So it does make it easier to impose uniformity. And that's one reason anyway, that we're seeing this uniformity, this hive mind throughout the West, is that you do have, Brussels subordinate to Washington, it just, we do have almost, not exactly a unitary state, but something that's approaching that.
Right. I just feel like it can't last forever, but something that I've always...
these self-destructive policies, right? In the end, they're their own worst enemies. In the end, it's really, it's not going to be Russia. Well, we never can be sure exactly how it's going to play out, but I think it's most likely it's just going to be our own self-destructive policies that bring us down more than anything else.
Right. Right. Yeah, I just feel like the writing is on the wall with the Ukraine war conflict. I'm sure there'll be some surprises, but Europe's going down. Russia will win this war, and I don't think we'll go nuclear. Just everything that
Yeah,
we see right now, just there's no positive news for Ukraine. I just don't understand how we can keep this going.
yeah,
At least I don't think
yeah,
we'll keep it going for much longer. But
right.
the situation, I was saying like earlier that I was wondering, what conflict is more important and what we should focus on. Because I've been consumed a bit more about the Ukraine conflict recently because we're coming towards the end game. I feel like it's quite
Mm-hmm.
interesting, and tragic. But it just felt like that after Syria and Hezbollah's not functioning doing so much anymore, and Iran has just been 2 months since the retaliation. It feels like everything's on the slow burner. But in my mind, actually, I think that the Middle East conflict is perhaps the more important one, the more potentially devastating one, because in my mind, I just don't see if Israel can get out of this. And if Israel can't get out of this, to me, this seems like something that can truly bring down America, because America has just tied itself completely to Israel. It's amazing when I watch the news here, just the support for Israel,
Yeah,
no matter what, our greatest ally will do anything, and they're going to try to get us into this war with Iran. Even if this war doesn't happen right away, I just feel like Israel, there's no turning around, which means that if it goes down, I just feel like the United States goes down with it, and then everything goes down, and that's where things get really dangerous. Israel's got nuclear weapons. I feel like they will use it as they're going down. And so this to me is the scariest conflict, even though
yeah,
it's not as in the forefront of people's mind. Do you
yeah,
agree? I mean, what's your thought
yeah.
on this?
Yeah, again, I would say that I, it, again, it is possible that the conflict in Europe could go nuclear. We can't discount that possibility entirely. We can't discount it because there always can be accidents. Especially as we get these hypersonic weapons and medium range, missiles that only allow minutes for the other side to make a decision. Everybody there could be, just as there was during the Cold War, there can be false readings by radar installations, and that can lead to, well, tragic. Actually, calling it tragic is an understatement. It could lead to the end of the world. It's not impossible. I think it's highly unlikely, but it's always there. And then again, there are these groups within Western Europe and factions within the U.S. administration that are absolutely committed to escalation and don't seem to have the healthy, necessary fear of nuclear war, and they could push us to the brink. It could happen, but I don't think it will. But on the other hand, it very I think it's really possible and much more likely to happen in the Middle East. And the reason I say that is that we have a nuclear power there, and I'm speaking of Israel, whose government is already kind of run by an apocalyptic cult. I don't think that's really much of an exaggeration. People like Smotrich and Ben Gvir, they they are the present in Israel. I mean, they are there in government with a lot of power. And Netanyahu is not a break on them at all. He's their ally. But they also represent the future. It seems like the trend has been going in their favor. And these are people that are willing to, destroy the Al-Aqsa temple.
Well,
And
that's the mosque and build the temple. Right?
yeah, the Al-Aqsa mosque, rather, I should say. And to sacrifice the red heifer. These are the kind of people we're talking about. They have no fear. I think rather the opposite. I think they would love to use a nuclear weapon on Iran, and especially if in Iran, which may very well happen, if the Ayatollah there lifts the fatwa on building nuclear weapons. I mean, there are some over the last couple of months, there have been statements that suggest that at least that's, the policy is being reconsidered. They have not actually. I don't think they ever had a nuclear weapons program. The CIA said they had one before 2003, but stopped it then. But I found, Gareth Porter's argument convincing that they never had one. But they may actually begin one. And they do have the means to develop a nuclear weapon. They may just think that they have to for their own survival because the U.S. and Israel are hell-bent on destroying them. So if that happens and it becomes clear that they really are developing a nuclear weapon, I think the pressure within Israel to take out the program is going to be, the nuclear weapons program in Iran is going to become overwhelming. And the thing is, I do not believe it can be done by conventional weapons. Again, these facilities are deep underground. They're in mountains, dispersed across a very large country. So they might go nuclear. They may try to use nuclear weapons to take out Iran's nuclear weapon program. But even short of that, it's just the other possibility, of course, is that that Iran and Israel go to war. So far it's been, there's been this exchange, but it's been going at a slow pace, and that may be just a conscious decision. I think it is actually by the Iranians. They really do not want to go up this escalation ladder, but they feel forced to do it. But on the Israeli side, now you have Netanyahu just feeling empowered by recent developments, especially in Syria, and with a great deal of support. He's seen his enemies fall one after another, and pretty much the last one on the list is Iran. And that's always been his obsession. So I think he's going to do what he can, to actually start a war. And now he feels with Trump in office, again, Trump is talked about and seems really to he really does want, I believe, to end the war in Ukraine. I don't think he's going to succeed at all, but he does appear to have that desire. He doesn't have that same desire for the Middle East, unfortunately. He has bought into the Zionist view of things, and I think he will. There's always a chance with Trump that he may just do a 180, but I think probably he's going to give full backing. Even it's not like Biden didn't give his full backing, but it'll be even quick. He'll be even quicker to support, let's say, the Israelis in the Middle East, which of course can mean war with Iran.
Right, and war with Iran means, I think, the end of Israel. Right. I mean, there's just no, Israel's a tiny country, and what we've seen Iran, its capability to, launch these missiles and strike Israel at will, essentially. What we saw was just a taste, from what I imagine. From my understanding, they have thousands of these missiles.
Right.
And, they've been very careful about not inflicting casualties on Israel, giving them warning, hitting military targets. But if we have an all-out war and we see Israel do something, like you said, if they use a nuclear weapon to try to take out a nuclear facility in Iran, that's the end, right? You can't just use a nuke and walk away, right? I mean, you're done. You're done, right? I mean, you use a nuclear weapon on a country like this, and that is allied very closely with Russia and economically, and so I believe there are joint military exercises with China as well, right? I mean, Iran, China, and Russia, that's a bloc that cannot be defeated by anybody, in my opinion. If this happens, this is why, in my opinion, this conflict in the Middle East is actually the most important one, and it's kind of been fading a little bit from the forefront. But this is something that is, right? It continues, and like you said, all trends are showing within Israel with Ben Gvir and Smotrich. This is the new phase of Israel, because what we've seen is there's been 1 million Israeli Jews that have left the country, but the people that stay, we're having a concentration of the extremists. Especially, we're seeing just we've talked before about sort of the demographics of Israel and how the settler movement, they have very large families, and it's their mission to create greater Israel, to take these lands, to start this. So we're seeing I think there's no turning the ship around for Israel. You can't get more secular, rational Jews coming back into Israel, especially at this point, who wants to go there unless you truly believe in the idea that we are part of a holy war, that this is a crusade, that we do need to create greater Israel, that this is the apocalypse is not something to be afraid of.
It's
That
something
this is
to
what
embrace. Yeah,
Right.
we
So-
win in the apocalypse. I mean, I think that's the notion that's spreading within Israel. Oh yeah, no, it's a very dangerous situation. Again, I don't know how things would play out in a war, but yeah, it's no question that Iran can do terrific damage to Israel and to American military assets throughout the Middle East. Both naval and land based. It would be a huge mess. It would be, and either the thing is like with a real war, if Iran is held back, I mean, I think it's clearly acted with great restraint so far. But if they find themselves under kind of a true full-scale attack by the U.S. and Israel, that they'll have their backs to the wall, and then they're going to fight for their own, for their existence. And the thing is that that could, and I think they would, if that happens, they'll do a great deal of damage, both to U.S. military assets and to Israel. And then Israel will find its back against the wall, and then there's a chance that it'll go nuclear. And then I'm just not making any predictions after that. But it's
Right,
just,
or the U.S. gets fully dragged in. Like this is
Right.
what I see. I don't see the U.S. getting dragged into war over in Ukraine. I don't see this blowing up World War III. We just see that there's no real support, within the populations. The elites
Right.
obviously are
Yeah.
their own, but they can't.
Yeah, there are
conscript.
Right. Yeah, right. That's
but
what we pointed out. Yeah, that's right. You just don't have the base for that, because in the end, if you're really going to turn the tide, in Ukraine, you need to actually send in soldiers. You have to have boots on the ground, and I just don't see that happening. There's just not the support for that. Nobody in Europe or the U.S. wants to do that. Go and fight Russians. But unfortunately, there are people that think that way within this country. They say we would go and fight the Iranians on behalf of Israel.
Right.
Unfortunately, we do have that. So
It's amazing that we have both of these conflicts happening at the same time, and it puts the U.S. in such a weaker state because we have really drained a lot of our military through the Ukraine war. We have seen that we don't, especially when it comes down to interceptors. I mean, that's really what these new modern warfare is. It's the ability to shoot missiles
especially
and intercept them.
Right, especially a war against Iran. It would be heavily dependent on interceptors, and it's clear that we have that we're
huge
very
shortage.
short of them. Right, and
Right. Because of what we've done in Ukraine.
Right. Yeah, and then again, so it would. There's some. Clearly, these, but again, we know like the production figures for something like the SM-3, it's supposed to be like a dozen a year. For the Patriot, it's supposed to be something like 550. And
you have to fire 2 Patriot interceptors.
Right, and they obviously often don't hit, their targets. Each one costs $4 million. The stockpiles have been reduced to just nothing. I think they are just drawing off production right now. So if you actually came into a shooting war, like in the first couple of volleys, the U.S. would have missiles and the Israelis would have some missiles, and then they would, essentially their chambers would be empty. They wouldn't have any more bullets to fire. It would just...
it's just madness. And then if you think about, Russia and China behind Iran and their production capacity, I mean, if Russia's outproducing all of NATO like 5-1 in most munitions, once China turns on its factories, we're talking about 100-1. It's just absurd that we're even entertaining this. But it seems inevitable that this is what's going to happen. I just don't see this Middle East war. I don't see an off ramp. We've talked about this before, so it just feels like this is where we're headed, and this will bring down the U.S. empire, which I guess is a good thing, but
well, we don't
just in such a horrible, violent way, I'm just thinking, will millions die? What's going to happen to America, to Europe? Will we see just everything break apart and just chaos across the country.
But you can also see it would be nice again if the U.S. just sobered up and said, okay, yeah, this kind of being the hegemon didn't make sense, but there may be this failing out and this, increasingly desperate attempts to maintain hegemony. That's the real danger. So I don't think.
And
it's
the more
likely.
probable path, don't you agree?
I think so too. Yeah. And I would just say, I just wanted to add about Iran. Russia and China, I don't think will become involved directly. But just as both China and Iran have a vested interest in Russia's victory, they do not want to see Russia defeated because, again, they know that if Russia were defeated, they would be next, right? That's just logic. But it's the same. The logic goes it's the same for Iran. Both China and Russia do not want and will make sure that Iran is not defeated, because if Iran is defeated, then they know that the West, the hegemons, are going to train their guns on them. And they'll be able to concentrate more resources on bringing them down. Right. So there's just.
It's just this insanity that we have to take out Russia, Iran, China, and within the U.S. establishment, it's just about which one do we want to focus on. That's all it is, and it's just so crazy.
That seems to be true, right?
And it's suicidal. None of those are viable options, and they shouldn't even be considered.
Yeah,
why? Right? Like,
yeah, exactly.
We've been trading with China. There's nothing. But it comes back to that mindset that I mentioned that my Norwegian friend was saying, like that there is this hegemonic mindset that's like, well, if there has to be a top dog. If we're not top dog, then we'll be ruled by China. We'll be ruled by Russia. Yeah. It's just such a stupid way of thinking. Right. But it's that's how a lot of people think, though.
Yeah. Well, that's the way that a lot of the neocons think too. I know that's. They put forth their arguments is basically if the U.S. doesn't rule the world, some other country will. It's likely to be China, and we don't want that. Mearsheimer himself, even though Mearsheimer actually supported the U.S. military vis-a-vis China, he has admitted that actually China has never shown the desire to be a global hegemon. It's just never been anything, not in the past nor in the present. They're just interested in, being the hegemon in East Asia there, which doesn't mean they have to rule over a country, but they have a sphere of influence. And that's it. They have shown no intention. It's never been part of their ideology, to conquer the world. It's not like what you see in the U.S., again, with the neocon ideology, the whole world has to, accept our way of life and align themselves with us. They don't think that way. So there's, it's silly, but I think it's a projection. You kind of assume that, we know that's the way we think. So they must be thinking the same thing. So if we lose, they're going to be, here pressuring us to adopt Chinese ways. And it's just, I couldn't care less, be honest.
No, yeah, it's actually, I feel like it's the opposite. I lived in China for over 10 years, and the Chinese have a great admiration for the West. And they love stereotypes. You talk to the Chinese, like, oh, the British, they're all gentlemen. I'm like, you need to go to UK. These lads out, they're not. But the same thing with like, oh, I love France. They have these very stereotypes. And they kind of love basically the multipolar concept. They like the idea of these different cultures and these civilizations, essentially. Right. They have no desire. They got 1.4 billion people. They have enough problems on their own hand.
Yeah, just holding themselves together. That's right.
Right. The rivalries are just between Shanghai and Beijing. Those types of things. Like, which is Shanghai's the better city by far. But
okay.
There is. I've never heard any type of talk from the Chinese ever in my 10 plus years about the idea that we're going to be number one. They don't even think that way. That's not their desire. Actually, it's often when I go taxi drive, they're like, "Oh, America, great! Oh, no, that's they have a great admiration for all these other countries and civilizations. There's no idea of that we need to have primacy over the world. That's an American concept, Western U.S. hegemony,
and it's a recent American concept. It's not the original American concept. It's spoken about,
right? Okay, all right. Well, we'll end it there, Dan. We've gone a bit over. Okay, have a good rest of your day.
You too.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye bye.